Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining for this S4 focused webinar, where we're going to talk about some of the risk and controls pitfalls that can befall S4 HANA implementations. I'm Tom Venables. I'm the practice director for Turnkey's application and cybersecurity practice, based out of the UK. So a lot of the S4 projects and design and implementations fall under our remit. And today we're going to talk about some of the things to watch out for, whether you're not yet embarking halfway through, or even if you've just completed your S4 journey. I know it's going to be part of a number of SAP customers' lives in the next, well, certainly 5 to 7 years, given the deadlines of when ECC 6 is due to be out of support. So without further ado, we'll dive straight in. And the first thing to watch out for is to understand that security is an equal to functionality. I've seen projects that try and treat security as a non-functional requirement, or even describe it exactly as a non-functional requirement. And therefore it gets treated as a separate work stream, often with less priority, less resources, and less attention from the project team. That's quite a dangerous route to take, because security requirements will often impact designs and testing, and you don't want to expose those late in the program. Any ERP implementation has elements of business process redesign. So you've got to incorporate the ways of working that ERP supports, and with S4, some of those ways of working have changed. A good example is your vendor and customer maintenance processes have been merged into the business partner concept, which many of you will be familiar with. So you need to amend the ways that people are working, and security is all about providing people with the access that they need to do their job. And that access is defined within the business process definitions. So you take an AP process and you say an AP clerk enters that invoice, but then you've also got to account for approval steps or control executions that have to be part of that. And if you're not exposing those up front and not treating those security requirements or risk and control requirements as equal to the functional requirements, you're going to run the risk of not exposing those until later in the project, testing later, and this will be a common theme, which then impacts the design, and you have to go back and split business processes. If you expose those requirements alongside all the functional requirements and treat them as equal, you'll have a much better time of proving that your functionality works. And I've seen programs develop that functionality without necessarily considering what it means for a real user. And what do I mean by that? I mean, they'll develop and test in early phases like unit test, or even early cycles of systems and integration testing with broad authorizations, things like SAP all. That's a big deal, because it shouldn't be an afterthought. These requirements are really important to your business. Depending on the types of controls that you're talking about, you might be talking about a license to operate issue. You know, breaches of data security, or breaches of key control processes in financial reporting, especially in heavily regulated industries, are going to fundamentally impact your capability to operate within your industry. It's important that anything that doesn't work for a user in the real world actually doesn't work. It's not enough to say, well, when we tested it with SAP all, it was fine. That's not gonna cut it when you can't use SAP all in production, and nor should you ever. So you need to understand that the solutions that you're designing work for a real world scenario. And if you incorporate those controls late in the project, if that's after test cycles of functionality, part of the issue that you've got is that you're going to invalidate test cycles that went before it, because you may have passed all of your functional testing with your SAP all profiles, but then it comes to a UAT cycle and it turns out that those processes no longer work because you've applied the correct restrictions to those users. The testing that went before is invalidated, so you have a regret cost because you've got to go back and revalidate all of that testing. And as I said, you may have to redesign as a result of that. So you want to try and expose your requirements early and with equal priority to the functional requirements. Some indicators that you might have fallen foul of this, or might be about to fall foul, depending on where you are in the process. take a look at your test cycles, see what access they're using to test. If you do see super user or massive combinations of roles or SAP all on your test scenario users, then that would be an indicator that you might not have exposed those early enough. You might not see negative test scenarios in your testing strategy or your scripts. By negative testing, we mean, can the role or can the user not do what they're not supposed to be able to do? As opposed to the positive test, which is, does it allow them to do what they should? The business process documentation, the swim lane diagrams that many of you be familiar with, don't necessarily incorporate the common security language that we use, like control points, risks, authorizations, or restrictions. They might simply talk about functionality and not capture those requirements. You might see within your budget or your project planning that you've not set aside any specific budget to deal with a security work stream or security objectives within the functional work streams. And you might not see any early cycle security objectives within your project plans. You need to expose those, not just from a business risk perspective as well, but also from an IT sort of general controls and integration point of view. So you want a scenario whereby you understand that 2 years from now you're looking at identity and access management solutions, and your designs need to take into account that you don't want to invalidate those forward-looking enterprise-level programs. Similarly, with cyber initiatives like SIEM, you know, if you're trying to expose information for incident and event monitoring, you need audit logging enabled in your SAP. Has that been captured? Are you looking outside of SAP and S4 as well as within the business controls? So how to avoid it? Get involved early or pay the price later is the theme. Make sure your functional consultants and your business process owners internally include the security considerations as part of their designs. Expose it, raise that priority with whoever your partner is that you're implementing with. Share the risk and controls matrices and the impacted controls per business process with the project manager and the functional work streams. Communicate that you have key priorities that you can't breach, and make sure that they incorporate those into the design. As I said, get involved early and ensure that they're understood and adhered to throughout the life cycle of the project and throughout the project team. Security isn't just one person's responsibility. Everybody has to get involved. And test your security with your functionality. So when you're doing your functional testing, do it in role. There isn't really such a thing as a security test script in isolation. What you have is a load of functional test scripts that should work in a secure environment. And as long as you link them together, you don't have to repeat test cycles. So you're actually saving effort and time if you go about that. The second key point is that security always equals some degree of effort. You need time, you need resources to not only reduce risk, but also take into account the user experience. And this is a piece that gets overlooked in S4 implementations. One of the big pieces of or benefits of S4 is the homogenized front end, the common user experience of Fiori, where I can log into an app from my desktop to approve somebody's leave request. And it looks very much the same as if I log into it from my mobile when I'm on the move. And that's a big use case. It gives us much greater productivity. But that user experience is driven by what we present to the user. As I said in the first point, the security is about giving people what they need to do their job. The point of the effort is you're always going to have to spend some time here. And I've seen people try and describe security as not a big consideration in S4 because SAP are delivering best practice roles. You can implement those nice and quickly, and they're a broad fit to the business processes that they describe, but they're not necessarily going to be the best fit for your organization and your users. They naturally carry broad levels of access, which makes navigation difficult. So it makes it more difficult for your users to follow the processes that you're specifying. The roles themselves, these best practice roles, do still contain some elements of risk when you run SAP's own GRC rules against them. There are risk violations that pop up against things like AP clerks and logistics operations that need to be taken into consideration. You can't assume that just because SAP said this role is good, that it's going to fit you and especially your risk profile. And it's a lot easier to get that out again early and before go live. If you start finding them after, you've got to go back and unpick all your designs. So again, there's that regret cost if you don't get involved early and understand that you're going to have to expend that effort. So the big deal to you, the reason that you need to expose this is because otherwise you're going to have delays and rework late in the project. If UAT isn't scheduled until 2 months before go live, and that's the first time you're exposing any security challenges or user experience challenges, then again, you've got to go back, you've got to redesign, you've got to retest. You've got to meet the expectation of the users. If they have been sold that it's going to be easier and they don't need as much training and there's only one way to do a process where before there were 6, you need to meet those objectives. They're going to be key to your success criteria for your S4 implementation. You run the risk that you're giving people access to applications that don't work, because you haven't fully configured the ones that weren't part of your test scripts, but they're in the SAP standard content, catalogs, groups, the Fiori elements of the authorizations build will be broader than necessarily what you want to present based on your business process definition. So you have to make sure that it's sort of laser focused in on what is my process, how do I want users to do this, and build the authorizations and the provision of that access in a way that supports it. Your subsequent audits after go live, you will get a grace period from most auditors if they're feeling kind to say it doesn't need to be perfect come go live. But 6 months after go live or a year after go live, and they identify segregation of duties conflicts or toxic combinations of access or even privileged access that users are gaining just a little bit too much to the system, that's going to be difficult to pick apart. Those remediation projects, and I've done dozens of them, they're not easy because you're revisiting design decisions that were taken by a project team that's exited. You're in a run and maintain function now, and you don't have the bandwidth that the project team did to design those processes with that laser focus. You might know that you're treating security as a bit of a non-event if during discovery, again, nobody's mentioning that sort of language that you're talking about. Nobody's talking about risks, control points. Your information security stakeholders, by which I mean not just the InfoSec teams, your security application teams, but also your internal audit teams who maintain the risk and controls matrices. You'll also see a lack of that language in the business process definitions or the functional designs. It won't be called out as what are the key restrictions here, what's the user experience. You might see that people have described the SAP standard content as an accelerator and advocated it strongly throughout the project without necessarily articulating to you the challenges that brings. And again, you might not see budget or time to ensure security objectives are met in those project plans. So what do you do about it? The key thing is to, again, shout about those control objectives. It's similar to the first point in that you've got to treat it as a functional requirement. You've got to work with the internal stakeholders to communicate that. You've got to make sure that you bring them into the project team. Trust me when I say internal audit, if they're not engaged in the project and then they find stuff afterwards, will be a lot harder to engage than if they were brought in at the start of the process. You have to understand your key control points. You've got to understand that the user experience objectives have to be surfaced in designs. So if you only want to present the apps that a user should be accessing, you're going to have to design the roles in a way that only presents those apps. So that's going to limit you from using some of these SAP standard content catalogs and groups. Make sure you understand the compromises in using accelerators. So understand that you might be presenting too many options to people, that you might be introducing risk. And if that's acceptable and that's the route that you need to take to meet timelines and cost objectives, get those compromises communicated and agreed at a senior stakeholder level. And test those solutions in conjunction with internal and external audit for your controls especially. So again, bring them in, don't exclude them, don't pretend that they're not going to find them, they will. but your auditors are there to support you. They're not there to attack you. So having them involved in the program, really working with you to say this is a well-designed, well-controlled solution that meets the objectives that we've laid out. You know, you've got support there that you can then take to the business and say, we're happy that this is going to meet our risk and control objectives. The final point is that S4 isn't necessarily equal to your previous ERPs. In fact, it almost always isn't. Whether you're going greenfield, brownfield, some combination of the two, there are changes in the way that your security operations are happening that you just can't avoid. You may have been operating SAP systems for the last 20 years, and your security functions know how to build a role. They've been doing it for ages, so they can manage S4, right? The truth is, actually, S4 implementations bring a load of changes that are inherent in the way that the solution is built, to something as simple as user administration. You had one SAP application server before. You now have an application server and a web services gateway that is serving the Fiori content, a front-end server, you might have heard it described as. You now need to maintain roles in both the front end for the presentation of that content and the user experience, as well as the back end, which is where all the authorizations are driven by. So what can a user see and do is in your front end. What authorizations control whether or not that works is in the back end. So logically, you have to maintain a user ID in 2 locations, as well as your roles in 2 locations. So you're increasing the workload. You're bringing new concepts into those authorization designs, like catalogs and groups, which I've referred to. These are collections of Fiori apps that are being presented to users. That's a different skill set. People have to be trained to maintain those. And also the processes that you're used to operating, I mentioned vendors and customers earlier, those processes are changing. So the security that you used to apply around those is slightly different. So if you're just assuming that because it's SAP to SAP, it's not going to be too difficult, you can fall a little bit afoul of not knowing that you need training support from your SIs or specialist services. And the ongoing resource. You may underestimate that you're about to double the overhead on key resources. Solutions that you may be operating for control, like SAP GRC, they might not be tailored for the changes that are coming. So with the vendor and customer example, for one, you used to report on, does somebody have this transaction to maintain a customer, and the ability to process sales orders against that customer, or likewise with vendors. Now it's, do they have the ability to maintain business partners of type customer through a load of different transactions and different authorizations? So you may have to reconfigure some of your key control processes. Your rack ends may require updating because the processes that you assumed controlled those are just simply not operating. Your 4I principles might have moved on your verifications. Your logistics processes, you might have changed who can enter counts and clear differences within the warehouse. So you might have new risks around stock misappropriation where you've got to amend those. The stakeholders might change. You know, as part of any business process redesign, the people or the groups that you are directing control executions to have to change. So don't assume that there's no need to take that into account. And again, it comes back to make sure that you're resourcing these elements within your programs effectively. Treat those requirements as equal to everything that went before, and you'll be much better equipped for a run and maintain operation where your control processes work hand in hand with the enabling technology. How do you know if you might be being a little complacent or not fully cognizant of some of those changes? The security team might not be part of the project program, or the key stakeholders are simply not involved. And when I say the security functions here, I am talking about the administrators. I used to be one for a long time, you know, creating roles and users in SAP systems. And we would often get projects that were delivered to us rather than with us. You might see that you haven't had RACM or controls documentation pulled into the project planning. That might be an indication that you're assuming you don't need to change that. again, speak to your internal auditors, speak to your control functions, speak to the risk owners or business process owners if you're lucky enough to have those really well defined within your organization, and just ensure that their objectives are captured as well. Make sure that you review the project plans and the budgets to see that time is allocated specifically to address those issues. Or if it's not, see if there's a separate program to update all of your enterprise RACMs and whether it's being folded into that. Make sure that you see the training is included in there. You know, the new concepts are different enough that the ABAP skills that we're all familiar with from previous SAP doesn't necessarily carry over. And your stakeholder maps don't expand out of the IT organization or the business organization that the scope of functionality is touching. So you're not actually touching your controls organization. All of those would indicate that you may not be giving enough priority to things that can come back and bite you and cost you a lot more in terms of time and money later. So what do you do about it? Well, make sure your security team is getting trained, make sure they're stakeholders to the project, make sure that they have input to designs and understand the design decisions that are being taken. Engage with the functional leads to understand where the control points have changed, where they have to be implemented through access controls, or where they might be a mitigating control to an existing risk. Update your control systems and processes to reflect the S4 operations. If you're running GRC and that's your segregation of duties monitoring, you need to change your rulebook. You've got to account for the S4 elements that are changing. So make sure that those key controls, documentations and processes are updated to reflect your new operation. And consider some technical solutions that will lighten the load on your security team. They're about to be, as I said, twice as busy if they're maintaining front and back end, let alone the catalogs and groups, which is an additional overhead. So you could consider implementing IDAM solutions like SAP IDM or SailPoint, where you can move user administration to a single point. GRC will also allow you to define business roles and do provisioning through that. Make sure that you've got some visibility of GRC solutions to understand your risks. So as these new roles are being defined, you can build them, run GRC and see if the risk profile of that process is changing. And think about your SIM integration. You know, a new ERP is an opportunity to expand or to integrate your cyber controls into that ERP and deliver a much more effective solution, which may have been ignored in the past. So think about integration points with wider control processes. So that's a whistle-stop tour of 3 of the big risk and controls indicators that projects can be running into problems. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and there are other issues around functionality and adoption and integrations. But those are the ones that are organizationally you can set yourself up to succeed with. In summary, get engaged early, communicate your controls and risk requirements before you start design. Test fully and often. You know, changes will happen throughout the project lifecycle. Make sure that the testing of those reflects the real world and have security objectives included in your SIT cycles at the latest. You know, you don't want UAT to be the first time that you test these things in anger. The user experience will be terrible if things don't work or if it's a confusing navigation. And that is late in your project cycle to start having those sort of challenges. And don't settle. You will always have continuous improvement of your security and controls throughout the life cycle of an ERP. So once you've gone live with your S4 implementation, make sure you've got continuous improvement plans. And by doing that early engagement of your stakeholders in the project, you're setting yourself up with a good stakeholder community throughout the life cycle of what is a key system to your business. Keep them engaged. You know, set up a quarterly change and advisory board around risks and controls. Keep that community working together and you'll be far better set up to operate the ERP for its life cycle. That is it from me. There is a little time for some questions if anybody has any. If you want to know more, we have a load of S4 content on our website. You can request a chat with any of our team of specialists. My contact details are there if you want to reach out to me directly and know more about S4. Please do get in touch. Any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'd like to thank you all for attending. I hope it's been interesting. Yeah, if you need to know any more, please do reach out to me. Thank you very much.